From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Frank Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues.
Chapter 25.
Whoa, Frank, I can explain.
Dandrikan stammered, his piss spraying wild. I'm short on patience, so unless you want me to drain you further, you'll answer me plain and speak quickly. Kyla growled in his ear. Her dagger was a cold edge against the underside of his jaw.
Yes, of course, my lady, if you'll pardon. You caught me at an inopportune moment.
Dandrikan began to quickly fumble to get his trousers tied. Did the kobold come to you after the job? Answer false and you'll speak next through a new hole in your neck.
Lindblood, is that you? I'm so glad you're alive. I was worried.
His voice cut off abruptly as the blade dug into the fleshy part of his neck. Any more pressure, and it would slice him open. Answer me, she snapped.
He did. Yes, the kobold came to me. He was wounded.
Dandrikan sputtered quickly. Kyla eased off the pressure on her blade to let him speak. And?
He said he needed a place to hide, but my shop wasn't safe either. That psychotic elf was coming for me next. And probably would have too if he didn't get a face full of knives first.
Then where is he? Where is Posuu?
I told him to hide in the only place I could think of where the elf wouldn't get to him. The Tower of the Wizard.
You sent him to a wizard? Kyla grabbed Dandrikan's curly hair. Were you trying to get him killed?
It's the lighthouse on the jetty. It's deserted. The wizard hasn't been seen for months, but there's warding spells all over the place there. It's safe. As far as I know, the little guy is still there, waiting for you.
Hope was a fluttering bird inside Kyla's chest. She couldn't let that distract her from what she had to do. This guy might say anything to get out of a red smile. And you just left him, injured. I should kill you, she said, fingers tightening on the dagger.
I thought I was the last one,
he said quietly. What?
When none of your crew came back, I assumed the elf got to you all.
Dandrikan's words stung. Her mind flashed to her days spent lying in bed with a fever, then later watching for him out the window at the market. All that time this man knew where Posuu was. Why didn't she go to him sooner? Dandrikan seemed to sense the tension change in her. He continued on.
I couldn't get over there myself. The Fernbrook spies were watching me. So I hired some hardbacks from Rounderville to go check on him. But on their way, they got attacked by a hell-touched warlock. They couldn't get close. We had to back off and wait.
Talking seemed to ease Dandrikan, even with a knife at his throat. The question was whether or not she could trust his words, and the better part of her wanted to. That foolish optimism which seemed woven into the very blood of Exalts was the only thing that now stayed her hand.
But I think you could get to him, though,
Dandrikan suggested.
If everyone thinks you died, they won't be looking for you.
This man was trying to get rid of her, and she wanted nothing more than to be gone. Kyla had been ready to run to the kobold the moment she found out where he was. But that would be foolish. The Fernbrooks had tried to kill them all for one stolen item, and that was still unaccounted for. Did he have it when you saw him?
Have what?
Dandrikan was playing dumb and she was sick of it. Kyla jerked the curly blonde hair, wrenching his head back. He yelped in pain.
Ow! No! I was ready to pay him, but he said he didn't have it. He stashed it in a safe place.
How do I know you didn't kill him and take it?
Because everyone is still looking for it. All the Fernbrook men. I'm even looking myself. My client is still very interested. He'll pay top coin.
That felt like a lie, but it didn't matter. Her business was done with this man. They could find different buyers in another city. If the item was worth this much carnage, it must be very valuable indeed. I never want to see you or that cursed thing again. You can find it and keep it for all I care. I just want my partner, Kyla said, her tone convincingly worried.
Very well then. Go get your kobold, dear Lindblood.
He urged.
I bandaged him as best I could, but I'm no healer. Kobolds are tough, but he can't stay in that tower forever.
There was a long pause. Kyla's knife poised, unmoving, ready with anticipation. Dandrikan closed his eyes and waited. If you've betrayed me, I'll find you again, and only the knife will speak." The blade rasped stubble as it moved away from his throat. Dandrikan rubbed the spot where it had been and turned. A thin tinge of red stained his fingertips. The woman was gone. The start of a smile crept into the corners of his mouth. Kyla tried to outrun the feeling of panic, but it was tenacious as a blackhound. It surged with each breath, each heartbeat. She knew it was foolish to run headlong through the city, and did her best to take whatever shortcut she had learned in her time living here, but Arathis would always be an infuriating maze to her. Twice she had to double back when she found the street she thought she wanted to be on began to curve away from her destination. It was on one of those sudden changes of direction that she caught sight of the hell-touched man. Of all the various types of people within the city, the hell-touched were about as uncommon as her own kind. Perhaps there was a type of cosmic balance at play here, but to see a rare sighting of one was the kind of thing that should stand out in a person's mind. At least it would have, if she had not been so hurried. It might have made her use more caution, and she could have avoided the terrible events to come. Instead, she had only one goal in her mind, and that was to find Posuu. And now she knew where to go. Nothing else mattered. If only she could get there in time. The third time she curved onto the wrong street, Kyla was done with this elven labyrinth. She could see the harbour, not far off to the right, but a row of close-set houses stood between her and the next lane. Kyla checked in either direction. Any other person on the streets was busy with their own lives. No one was looking directly at her. She decided to abandon caution entirely. Sprinting forward toward the candle shop, Kyla launched herself off of the lip of a large potted fern out front. Catching the ledge of the rooftop, she planted her feet on the side of the building. The enchantment in her boots caught traction, and she pushed off again, straight upward, the force propelling her onto the roof. Kyla rolled and was on her feet, using the momentum to gain speed. An open courtyard stood ahead and below her. That would be too slow to climb down and too far to jump across. Instinctively, her mind drew a path to the next rooftop. Kyla raced toward the flat wall that abutted the side of the courtyard. Without slowing, she angled her body and stepped against the vertical surface. Again her boot gripped tight, and with a few long strides, she leapt down from the wall onto the opposite rooftop. Then springing off a post, she again ascended onto the support beams of a leafy trellis. Balanced cat-like, she ran on, launching herself recklessly across a narrow street and onto a balcony. This time she leapt back and forth between two narrow buildings. Then catching onto a smooth tree trunk, she slid until her feet touched ground. Ahead of her was an open street to the docks. At the far side was the jetty, and at its very end, with wind and waves crashing against the rocky shoreline, was the lighthouse. "Almost there," she said between breaths. "Just hang on." Kyla was familiar with the lighthouse, so knowing where to find it wasn't a problem. In fact, it was the first place that she and her team had cased as a potential target when they began to work together in the city. Probably not a coincidence that it was Dandrikan himself who brought the place to their attention. It had been something the man had been salivating for like a hungry dog watching through a fence at a ham bone. Deliciously tempting and just out of reach. The story was, a reclusive wizard had taken up residence inside. And the very few who had seen it said the place was full of magical items and powerful objects of an arcane nature. A veritable treasure trove for someone who traded in such things, sure to yield a fortune if sold. The younger generations of elves were the perfect customers for such things, too lazy to learn magic for themselves, and obscenely wealthy enough to pay boxes of gold to own enchanted items which required little effort to produce magic. From what she knew of Dandrikan, however, he never had the kinds of objects that were popular amongst the young elves, though. They didn't want nasty things set with curses, or could only do hurtful tricks. So stealing some high-quality magical goods could be a real change of fortune for the dealer. The job turned out to be insanely dangerous, and was unanimously voted down by all except Dandrikan, whose vote didn't count. No matter how much gold the man could promise them, it was not worth invoking the wrath of a wizard. After that, things began to turn sour between them and the dealer. They never ended up taking any of the commissioned work he proposed, at least before this last one. Dandrikan's jobs were either poorly conceived, reckless, or were casually nonchalant about a member of her team getting caught or killed. However, they did manage to smooth things back over again by selling him any unexpectedly cursed or otherwise unwanted goods from other jobs. A man like him was an unfortunate necessity in her line of work. Dandrikan's callousness prickled in her mind as she approached the lighthouse. Kyla wondered how wise it had been to send her friend here. If the wizard returned suddenly, how would he react to finding a kobold inside? Or her, for that matter? The lighthouse itself had magical protections on it, but they discovered that the front door remained unlocked. A person could simply stroll right in, easy as you please. Whether this was a fiendishly wicked psychological tactic meant to just beg some black-hearted idiot into attempting to steal something and get their bones turned to acid, brain eaten by carnivorous ants, or something even more terrible than that which only a maniacal wizard could concoct. Or on the other hand, perhaps the old guy just didn't like locking his door. Both options were equally possible. This is why you never steal from wizards. Nearing the far end of the jetty, Kyla tried to look casual, like just any ordinary Arathenian, out for a solitary stroll near the magical tower of an unknown and possibly dangerous wizard. But after running across half the city in the hot afternoon sun, she was a sweaty mess. The moment she entered the shadow of the lighthouse, however, an icy chill ran through her. There was a primal energy which seemed to corrupt this place. It made the exalt markings along her skin twinge with discomfort. The lighthouse itself had a squat stone building which stood at its base. Their reconnaissance had revealed this was the wizard's home, and apparently some kind of metallurgic workshop. Every other wizard Kyla had known, and there had been a few, were deeply invested into the study of magic. They filled their homes, or castles, or dungeons, wherever they chose to live, with books on magic and the arcane. They practiced spells and invented new ones. It was all they were interested in or ever wanted to talk about. But this one was different. He liked things that moved by mechanical force. Gears and pulleys, switches and levers. His books were about how to create things from wood, metal, rope and glass. Even though everything she had seen was spied through the strangely unfloored windows. Kyla didn't have to step inside to recognize an obsessive when she saw one. This man had ideas. And that could be both wondrous and catastrophic. A light flared above her, and Kyla looked up in time to watch as the broad sweep of its beam pass over her, and out onto the water. Then something in the position where she stood in relation to the building was somehow entirely familiar. It was a memory of this place, this view. And then she understood it immediately, like a native tongue spoken in a foreign land. A literacy with the very fabric of symbols, portents, and signs of all matter to have existed or might sometime come into being. The tower looked exactly like the tree in her dream, or rather the tree as an immutable emblem, a fixed point in the order of time. This place and time and her, all meeting together gently and unavoidably. The dream was merely an echo, but one that came before the voice could shout, and not one for others to interpret and ponder over, but hers to live if she chose it so. Kyla understood that this was the place where she was always meant to pause briefly, before moving on to the other points ahead or behind. Time moved in circles if you looked, and tunnels if you moved. She could then see this is where the mighty phoenix lashed the tree and destroyed its branches. Then it was always a tower, with light at the top. This lighthouse. She almost ran in that moment, forgetting everything that came before or what could happen after. The cascading sensation of fear and impending doom closed in, trying to shake her from where she stood, like there was some kind of force which opposed destiny itself, an anti-fate attempting to break this destined convergence. The sound of hoofbeats in full gallop snapped Kyla out of her transcendental reverie. She turned to see a man riding down the jetty towards her. A moment later, she recognized it was the hell-touched she had spied earlier. Kyla instantly recognized he was coming for her, and he was bringing destruction with him. The hell-touched dropped the reins and began to wave his arms. Tails of flared energy rose around him as he called some spell into being. Pure instinct took over, and Kyla sprinted in the opposite direction toward the lighthouse. Her years of living on the wrong side of the law taught her that a target moving at random vectors was much more difficult to shoot. She hoped the same principle applied to spell work. Just as Kyla pivoted sharply on a new trajectory, a blast of bluish light blazed past her, missing by inches. She could feel the ice crystals form in the humid lakefront air. The thunder of hooves was getting closer. The hell-touched would not miss at this distance, no matter her evasion. Kyla had one option left. She hit the front door of the lighthouse and punched down the latch. By some mercy, it was still unlocked, and she dove inside, kicking shut the wooden door just as another spell hit. A deafening boom hit the building, but oddly, only the terrifying sound found its way inside. An electric and altogether quite satisfying crackle rippled through the building and dissipated out the other side. Kyla paused. The wards this wizard had created were indeed strong. She stood, suddenly feeling confident. "Just try and come for me, see what befalls you, dirty fallet," she yelled, knowing the hell-touched would hear her. For a moment, he looked ready to call her bluff and try to enter. But after more taunts and cursing, her venomous posturing seemed to give him pause. Kyla stood by an elevated window and watched as he cast about in an angry tantrum, then mounted his horse and thundered off back toward the docks. Kyla slumped in relief on the lighthouse stairs for a moment. The ecstasy of not being killed abruptly switched to concern as she realized where she was, inside the wizard's house. But if a trap had been laid for intruders, surely she would have been its victim by now. And maybe Posuu had discovered all of them already and had disarmed them, as his talent had always been. Posuu, her love, her brother, her friend. He was so close now. All she had to do was climb the stairs. The strength of hope moved in her legs, and she found herself rising. Stair by stair, footstep by footstep, she pushed herself on. She could see his face, his smile, a charm that most overlooked when all they saw was a kobold. He was smart and clever, and cute, if one could have the eyes to see it. He had been her first friend when she had fled the caregivers, the first one to see her as a person, and not just an exalted, someone to be exploited for gain. Not only did the kobold know how to use the parts of cities that most avoided, he was kind and thoughtful. Somehow, through every terrible thing he had experienced, Posuu chose to rise above it, and to give, even when he had none, protect one who could be so easily exploited. From then on, Kyla pledged to love and trust him above all else. And the beauty of it was no one would imagine a more unlikely duo. One could not find a more overlooked creature than a kobold, nor a more attractive figure than a beautiful Linblood woman. What could be better for a team of thieves than the ability to control the attention in one way and go unnoticed in another? The tower seemed to rise around her, and as Kyla got closer to the top, she began to call out for him. "Posuu! It's me! Posuu!" Kyla called upwards, hoping her words would find his ears. Give him strength, whatever he needed to carry on. She got to a heavy door that opened into the lantern room. She shouldered it open and stepped through just under the large, sweeping light beam. I got here as soon as I could. Aside from the constant rumble of gears, it was eerily still. Kyla looked in every corner, if a round room had such a thing, but her head moved too fast, and her eyes resisted focusing enough to actually see anything. She forced herself to slow down. An awful cramp was pulling a knot in her stomach. She closed her eyes and took a breath. Warm streaks of wet ran down her cheeks. Then Kyla looked and saw it. Her gaze locked on something formless and incomprehensible. Kyla blinked away a blur that kept filling her vision until finally she made sense of what it was she was seeing. A body. Dehydrated. Pale, blue-grey, scaly skin stretched over a frame of bones. Too large to be a child, and skeletal formations too distinctive to be anything but a kobold. He had expired on his side, holding a wound. A thick mat of dried blood pooled out around him. Some kobold died up here. How odd, Kyla thought distantly. Its face was a rictus grin of sharp dragon teeth and shriveled eyes in large hollow sockets, the points of horns jutting from the back of its head. How could this one be up here? It didn't make sense. Posuu would have helped him. Posuu wouldn't let someone die. Kyla wanted to scream, but she couldn't. Why couldn't she? Mercifully, another woman then began to scream, and it was right. But then she had to breathe and realize the person screaming was her. This wasn't real. It was all she could think. Somehow the wizard's tower had tricked her, made her believe her beloved was gone, just a desiccated husk. The real kobold was on the other side of a membrane reaching out to her, his hand extended like in the dream. Then looking sad, knowing she could never reach him. Not anymore. Kyla collapsed. She cradled his body against hers. Even when the phoenix beat its wings against the tower, she held him. And it wasn't until the hard men in grey pried her fingers apart and slid the bag over her head, making all go dark, that she lost him again and knew she would see him no more.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.